I've met my tree quota, now like and subscribe. Whether you've been taking a break from OP13 or you've been running the EMU Ace Gauntlet, now OP14 is here, and that means that there's going to be a lot of new decks that can potentially come into the meta. Especially with OP14, there are a lot of very strong new decks, so in this video we're going to talk about how these new leaders contend with the old meta, and how some things are going to change when EB03, for example, hits as well. First, before we talk about what has changed, let's talk about exactly why it has changed. Now in OP13, there were three unequivocal best decks in the format: EMU, Ace, and Zoro. And while Zoro was a little bit far behind the other two, it was still one of the strongest decks in the meta if you just didn't want to play one of these other two really powerful decks. But in OP14, while you still may see Ace and EMU, you really don't see that much Zoro. So first, explaining why Zoro has disappeared. There's a lot of counter cards that have been printed out in OP14, and these counter cards, while more specifically targeting Ace and EMU, have also subsequently hurt Zoro. But another big reason for why Zoro just is completely absent in the OP14 meta is because of the new Mihawk leader. Mihawk has the ability to restand 3 dong if there's a 5 cost on the field. This is, of course, very powerful, though you can't play a character after that. But specifically against Zoro, the first part of Mihawk's leader ability is very, very relevant. Against Slash leaders, Mihawk is permanently 6,000 power. And this means that not only are you 6,000 power against Zoro, but also decks like Roger, who has the Slash type, are really, really struggling within this meta just due to the fact that Mihawk exists. And having a 6,000 power 5 life leader that gets so much value throughout the course of the game is very, very difficult to overcome. While these matchups aren't necessarily complete auto losses, it's just very difficult on top of the other things that we will mention next. Now, what are these other things that have specifically countered EMU and Ace? Well, firstly, let's talk about board protection. The 6-cost Marcus Mars is completely devastating for a lot of aggro decks. Even if you are trying to rush down EMU, getting rid of one of your stronger characters that are 5-cost or less while also setting up a blocker can really, really stunt your board development. It's for this reason we haven't really seen very many aggro decks succeed in OP13. However, in OP14, instead of making stronger aggro decks, though some of them do exist, Bandai elected to create stronger 5-costs. These 5-costs are just very, very difficult to remove. X-Drake, Tashigi, and Virgo are all really exceptionally powerful and well-statted cards that are just extremely difficult to remove from Marcus Mars. And because these cards aren't KO protected and they're removal protected, it also protects them against Joseph. So in this way, these very sticky mid-range bodies are a way to counter the decks that have been so powerful in OP13. But of course, this isn't the only hurdle that has been printed in OP14. In OP14, we also have some very powerful on-KO effects. Cards like Mr. 2, Bonclay, Dr. Hogback, the 4-cost Baby 5, as well as the entire leader effect of Boa Hancock are just very big obstacles that are very difficult to actually overcome. Yes, you can get rid of these characters, but maybe the card that comes after that, whether it's the extra life that you get, the life that's peeled, or the character that's played onto the board, may end up being stronger than we actually ended up KOing. And in this way, these KO effects are also very good against Zoro as well. If you were to rest their character and hit into it, for example, with the 3 dong given from the 5-cost Tashigi from Green Zoro, then they might just get something stronger and you're forced to hit the opponent's leader. So in this way, just because there are much more stronger, much more stickier bodies in OP14, these sorts of decks have come down a little bit in power, though still, EMU and Ace have prevailed as premier picks within this meta regardless. Where OP13 brought a lot of consistency to the game, OP14 isn't necessarily trying to push OP13 out the meta like OP13 did to every single meta before that, and is instead trying to combat in a very different way. Objectively, OP14 leaders are stronger than OP13 leaders. However, that comes at a big cost, and that is consistency. Then you have this sort of duality. Are you on the light side of consistency playing OP13 decks, or are you on the dark side for absolute power, praying that you get your top draw, because if you do, then you're always going to win. But it's for this reason and the duality between consistency and power that it's very tricky to actually rank these decks. So any deck is actually very good. You just need to choose if you prefer the consistent route or the powerful route, and also, of course, what works best for your playstyle. All of these decks are good, and all of them are A-tier alike with equal strengths and weaknesses. Though one deck I do believe is a little bit better than the rest, but not very significant, and that is going to be EMU. EMU is going to be the king of consistency, and also, of course, when you get to that 10 dong turn, you'll still be able to do your 27 dong play for only 4 dong, and this has not changed in OP14. In fact, it's actually gotten stronger. In OP14, EMU has gained the new Ground Death card. Ground Death, being able to rest 3 dong total, makes it so that one of the opponent's 5-cost characters is negated. This means that the opponent cannot use their blocker effects, nor can they use other effects like KO protection or on-KO effects, which are very relevant in the case of things like Baby 5 and the 5-cost Tashigi, or more importantly, the 5-cost Virgo. As EMU, because you now have some new tools to be able to close out the game in this Ground Death, you'll find yourself using Nasjuro just as a simple 3-cost 5,000 rush character a lot more often than you did before. In the mirror as well, just using it as a 5-cost 5,000 rush to get in that one extra hit can be relevant, relevant because when you're throwing the same characters at each other over and over again, you're going to need that one extra attack to get that one extra leg up. So do keep this in mind that just using Noshiro as a simple rush character is not bad at all, because importantly, Emu in OP14 is not just the end-all be-all absolute demon of the late game. When it comes to late game, Hancock and Mihawk actually end up beating Emu, and this is due to a couple of reasons. Mihawk has a lot of very strong new cards like the 7-cost Shanks, and Hancock has a lot of very good cards like the 9-cost Hancock into the Perfume Femur combo. If you wait too long, the opponent's going to have a lot of time to set up their characters and eventually overwhelm you with these. So if you're playing Emu, make sure to be a little bit more aggressive than you were in OP13 and you'll still be fine. When Emu gets high rolled by some of these decks like Ace, Emu, or Hancock, yes, he will end up losing a lot more than he did in OP13, but this is going to be true for basically every other leader. Emu doesn't have to worry about drawing his cards because he almost always will. For this reason, he just needs to worry about his matchup spread, and overall it's still very good. A lot of the decks that people bring to fight things like Mihawk, Hancock, or Ace are actually bad into Emu, so the more that people disrespect Emu, the stronger Emu becomes. Still, the Ace matchup that a lot of people are arguing over who's actually favored in this matchup has become more Emu favored now that Ace is forced to tech into other matchups. If you've been playing Emu in OP13, I feel like you'll feel comfortable playing this deck in OP14 as well, but you will need to put in quite a bit of time to make sure that you understand these new matchups because there are a lot of traps that Bandai has set up in this new meta. Up until a couple of weeks ago, I just assumed that it was going to be Emu and Ace at the top for the entire meta, but as the meta has developed and as people have started to understand how to counter these decks better, not just through deck building but by play, Ace has started to come down a little bit. So let's now talk about where Ace falls in the meta. Ace is a deck that hasn't lost anything, but also at the same time hasn't gained anything either. It's for this reason that although Ace hasn't changed at all, he has become slightly weaker because there are more matchups that he needs to tech into now. Before, with only needing to focus on the Emu matchup and the mirror, you were able to tech in things like the OP08 Whitebeard to slow down the opponent's attacks. But now that that card isn't really that great into the overarching meta with things like Hancock and Mihawk now in mind, people have been taking it out in favor of cards that deal with those decks better. Cards like Red Ruck are very good in OP14, being able to deal with the opponent's 9-cost Hancock, 7-cost Shanks, 9-cost Mihawk, 10-cost Law and Beppo. There's so many very good targets for Red Ruck, and for that reason a lot of aces have been running 3 to even 4 Red Rocks. And also there's another tech specifically for the Mihawk matchup, and that's a card that you probably haven't seen for quite a while, in that never, because it was printed last set and wasn't used last set, in the new Ace, Sabo, and Luffy 1-cost. Now this 2k counter, if you attach a Dome to your leader, makes it so that you can reduce the opponent's character by 3000. Effectively, it's just a super pumped up Gordon with 2000 counter, but it does cost 2. And this cost was relatively heavy before because you were wanting to play on curve a lot of the time as Ace, but in this new meta, because Mihawk's characters are very, very high in power, and a lot of times your characters end up being reduced in power, being able to take out the opponent's characters relatively cheap while also getting a Dome onto your leader to activate your leader effect is very, very nice, and for that reason a lot of people have been taking in this card. Still though, by taking in these cards for these new matchups that exist, the Emu matchup has become a little bit weaker, as we mentioned. So while Ace is still going to be an exceptionally consistent and powerful deck, he doesn't necessarily excel in one single thing. He's a jack of all trades in this meta and is going to be extremely consistent, so if you enjoy playing Ace, you'll still be completely fine within the meta. He does have a couple more weaknesses now. Recently, privately, I've been thinking a lot about if I want to really stay at my job or if I want to do YouTube full time, and I've never really talked about it on video because I've just never really been sure about how I would go about that, how I'd really be able to make a living. But I am inching closer and closer to being able to do YouTube full time. And if you guys are for that, even if you don't use a subscription feed, because I know everyone just looks at recommended anyways, if you could consider subscribing, let me know that you really want me to do YouTube full time, then it'll help me sort of make that decision, because it's a very scary one for sure. I don't have any sort of subscriber goal, but if you can just let me know that you enjoy the content, whether it's through liking, subscribing, commenting, making alt accounts, making 2 alt accounts, getting on your sister's account, getting on your mom's account, I kid. But if you guys let me know that you would want to see that, then I will absolutely consider it. And it is something that I do want to do. It is just a little bit scary. I can't really say something like when we reach 35,000 subs or 40,000 subs and I'll quit my job or something. But the more that you guys have been supporting me and being so nice in the comments, the more I've started to consider it. So it's working, and just let me know if you really want that. Anyways, now on to Mihawk and Boa Hancock. Starting with the greatest swordsman, Dorakyuri Mihawk. Mihawk is a deck that can be summed up with 2 words: inconsistent. Brute force. Mihawk generally has a pretty standard curve of trying to play the 5-cost Tashigi on 5 or 6, the 7-cost Shanks on 7 or 8, and chaining that into other cards like a second 7-cost Shanks, 9-cost Mihawk, or the 10-cost Law and Beppo to close out the game with the cards in power that you have on the board. These cards that you have on the board are so exceptionally powerful, Tashigi essentially being just a immovable 5-cost 8,000 character, and Shanks having a ridiculous effect, being able to rest the opponent's characters on the turn that he's played if you use your lead effect, and also every subsequent turn after that once he attacks, while also reducing the opponent's characters by 1000 power on the opponent's turn makes it so that this deck just keeps hitting you, hits you very hard, and it's very hard to counter him because their characters are so high in power, your characters are reduced in power, and he leaves up so much dong to be able to counter your attacks with counter events. There are two versions of Mihawk, and that is the Supernova version and the more traditional version. Starting with the traditional version, this version tends to run the 1-cost Perona as the only search within the deck. This, alongside things like the 1-cost stage, is the only means that this deck has of digging through your deck and finding your power card in the 7-cost Shanks. Because this version doesn't have to waste valuable spots in the deck for searchers, you're completely free to put in lots of mirror tech, for example. Things like the 5-cost Carrot are very good. That being said though, because you are only running one searcher and a sage that, while it technically does dig through your deck, only digs one card through your deck, you are going to have less consistency and therefore a little bit less explosive power when you're going second. Generally, Mihawk is okay going first and second, so you want to be taking away what the opponent wants, but in the case that the opponent does get what they want, you're always going to feel like you're a little bit far behind, especially if you can't find your pieces. The Supernova version of Mihawk covers a couple of the issues that this standard version has, and that is going to increase your consistency while also giving you a couple of better plays to play when you're going second. Not only is the 6-cost Law a very good play, but the 5-cost Bonney is also a very good way to flip the matchup, especially in the mirror when you're going second. Playing this card on 6 dong to lock the opponent's dong on that 7 dong turn means that they won't be able to play out the 7-cost Shanks first, and this is very, very valuable. So while the traditional version may have things like the 5-cost Carrot to lock your opponent's characters once they come out, like that 7-cost Shanks, the 5-cost Bonney just makes it so that card just never comes out to begin with, at least on curve. Still, with more searchers in the deck, you're going to have more consistency, but because the 1-cost Bonney and 2-cost Kid Killer searcher can't actually find things like that 7-cost Shanks or 5-cost Tashigi, you will need to just naturally draw them, meaning that while you do have some more consistency and more options in your game plan, you aren't necessarily making your single best game plan stronger. So what do you do in the face of Mihawk? Well, simply put, Mihawk, because there are so many strong cards that you feel required to put into this deck, he doesn't actually have that many small 1k or 2k counters in the deck. Just consistently hitting at smaller thresholds like 5 and 6k throughout the game are going to be very, very annoying for a deck like Mihawk, and this is the best way to counter Mihawk. So that's not going to assure your victory, because when that Lon Bebo comes onto the board, Mihawk's leader is now going to be 7,000 power on your turn. With that 11,000 power character on the board and his leader at 7,000 power, his entire board being 8,000 to 9,000 power, you're not just hard-pressed to take out the opponent's board, but you're hard-pressed for time, as the amount of power on Mihawk's board is just going to brute force the way through any blockers and any counter that you have. On the final turn, when Mihawk decides to go for lethal, he can use Dead Man's Game, use his leader effect to get 3 dong back, effectively only using Dead Man's Game for 1 dong, very reminiscent of a deck like Green-Purple Luffy and how he used Dead Man's Game to just break through all of your defenses and try to go for lethal. So, do you want to go towards the consistent, more flexible version of Mihawk in the Supernova version, or are you just going to go all in on power and play the traditional version, hoping that you draw your cards? Because if you do, really there isn't much that the opponent can do to stop you. The other most prevalent deck in OP14 is going to be the Queen of the Sea, Hancock. Hancock is a deck that has a lot of things going for it and a lot of things going against it, and most of the things going against it are just people hating on the deck, me being one of them. I actually put out a video very recently on a couple of ways to fight against Hancock, so if you are struggling against this deck, make sure to check out that video as well, because it'll give you a couple of head start tips for any deck. So the reason why Hancock is strong in this meta is not because it's just a yellow trigger deck, it's because it's a yellow trigger deck with an actual deck connected to it. And this is what I mean by that. Generally, yellow decks are lower in power and are made up for in triggers. In this way, yellow decks can never really be that strong, because if they're strong and also have higher potential through their triggers, it makes it very oppressive to deal with. Yellow decks therefore are balanced to be a little bit below average, and with triggers become above average. And in this way, yellow is just innately going to be very inconsistent, because you aren't going to be getting your triggers all the time, and potentially if the opponent decides to starve you, you may not get a chance at getting them anyways. However, the reason why I think Hancock is strong is because it does exactly what we worried about with yellow. It is a baseline solid deck that with triggers can go completely crazy. Not only this, but with things like the 2-cost Nyomba and the 2-cost Hyori, you can make sure that you get the trigger that you want, and that is of course going to be the 6-cost Gorgon Sisters. 6-cost Gorgon Sisters, once you show 3 of your Kuja Pyro or Amazon Lily type cards, then you can attach Dong to all of your characters and leaders. And if you can get this card onto the board off of your first or second life, the game could just be as good as over. So for this reason, Hancock has insane high roll potential in this card, while also having a very stable game plan in the case that you don't trigger it as well. Having the 4-cost Hancock to attach a Dong to your leader while being able to ensure your next couple of turns, the 6-cost Kuma to then increase your life while also establishing a body the opponent doesn't really want to get rid of with that on KO effect, and closing out the game with the 9-cost Hancock to reduce the opponent's life and set up for your Perfume Femur combo that we've talked about in so many videos at this point, is just a devastating game ender. Hancock is really good at one thing, and that is finishing the game. It's very tricky to clear Hancock's board because of her leader effect, and it's very hard to hit into the opponent's leader because of these triggers. And in this way, it feels like a lot of times it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation against Hancock that really puts the onus on the opponent to know how to fight against your deck rather than the actual Hancock player to know how to pilot their deck. If your opponent doesn't know how to fight into Hancock and overzealously hits into your life and you get a couple of triggers out in the early game, you may just have so much tempo on the board that the opponent can't manage to deal with it, because if they clear your boards, then they start to lose life, and the more life they lose, the more potent your 4-cost Pudding or the 2-cost Perfume Femur become. So in this way, especially if you're not going to play Hancock, you need to know how this deck functions to be able to successfully beat it. Talking about it too much here is going to end up reiterating a lot of things that I said in that video, so make sure to check out that video if you are still curious about this. But for the Hancock players here, because Hancock is still going to be a very popular and powerful deck, this section is going to be for you. Really what you want to be doing is playing on curve and trying to get that Gorgon Sisters by any means necessary. Hold on to it in your hand as much as possible in the event that you end up triggering out things like You'll Frighten Me or the 9-cost Hancock, and of course, if you can, in the early game, put it into your life with that 2-cost Yori or the 2-cost Nyomba. Getting the Gorgon Sisters out onto the board early on is really going to give you a lot more power, and because this is a reoccurring effect, it's actually going to be tricky to find timings to hit with it. But honestly, especially if you have a blocker on the board, you should just keep hitting with this Gorgon Sisters, getting that one extra 6k attack, again, with that Dolan attachment effect. And even if the opponent does manage to end up taking out the 6-cost Gorgon Sisters, they lost 1 life as well. So as Hancock, really you just want to be in this sort of Bella Betty mindset where you're just trying to push the opponent over as fast as possible and have these inevitable cards like the Perfume Femur. Really, once the opponent gets down to 0 life, there isn't too much that any deck can do, so a lot of times that 16,000 leader with the 4-cost Pudding or a simple 20,000 from that 9-cost Hancock and Perfume Femur is just going to be enough to close out the game, and that is going to be what you're going to play towards. Because Hancock is a more aggressive go, go, go type of deck, a lot of times you're not really trying to respond to what the opponent does, but you're just trying to set up as many obstacles as possible to try to make it as annoying for your opponent to deal with. The 4-cost Hancock as a simple blocker can force the opponent to take 1 of their life when it ends up blocking and dying, but also it can be an attacker, so know exactly what's going to be the most annoying for the opponent rather than what's going to actually be the best for you in that one specific scenario. Maybe leaving that character as a blocker is going to help you more than just getting that 1 extra 6 or 7k attack through, because even if the opponent has 10 cards in hand, if they're at 0 life, can they really defend against a 20,000, let alone twice potentially? Only your opponent knows the answer to that, and your job is to just keep asking the question, can you deal with this? 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 And by the way, yes, this is obviously filmed on a different day, and yes, it is snowing, yes, it is freezing. I'm also next to a lake, Bioko by the way, which is the biggest lake in Japan. Pretty cool. But one more thing that I forgot to mention about Hancock is that the 5-cost Nami is not printed yet, and that means that a significant power card, especially in the mid-game, just doesn't exist yet for the West. Once EB03 rolls around for the West and you can tech this card into the deck, it'll make it so much more powerful, but until then, this deck may feel a little bit lacking in power, though still quite powerful. Maybe it'll be more akin to some of the traditional yellow decks where it's a little bit less in power. When you get that Gorgon Sisters, you pop off. But once you get that 5-cost Nami, I mean, everything goes crazy, I guess. Still, while these 4 decks are generally agreed on to be the strongest in the meta, there are a lot of decks that could be extremely powerful if just one deck didn't exist, and that one deck, of course, is Ema, everyone's least favorite or most favorite deck, depending on who you ask. If Ema didn't exist, then many decks could be potentially viable, just because Ema's an extremely oppressive deck by nature. However, for this video, let's talk about 3 briefly and exactly how they may stack up into the meta. Generally, all of these decks have a pretty solid matchup spread into 3 out of the 4 decks, with Ema being the one that you need to throw away. So let's talk about their merits and demerits if you just don't really want to play one of these top 4 decks. Starting with one of the strongest in the meta, Blue-Purple Luffy. Blue-Purple Luffy is a deck that was very powerful in OP12, fell off a little bit in OP13 due to the fact that things like Green Zoro and Emu were matchups that you particularly weren't excited to see, but in OP14, because there are new decks like Mihawk and Hancock that exist that are actually good matchups for Blue-Purple Luffy, he has come back in resounding fashion. The deck has changed slightly, though it does play around the same similar core of being able to ramp quickly up to 10 dong to play out your 9-cost Sanji into your 8-cost Roger, which is finally out in the West, thankfully. A new card has been teched in, and that is the 9-cost Mihawk. This 9-cost Mihawk, being able to bottom a 7-cost or less, easily bottoms one of the opponent's 7-cost Shanks, 6-cost Kuma, 5-cost Nami, for example, and is just, in general, a very, very strong card. A reason why a lot of decks can beat Emu is not because they're necessarily faster than Emu, but because they can out-survive Emu in a couple of different ways, whether it's Mihawk being able to rest his characters and just brute force his way through, or Hancock being able to brute force her way through with the cards that she has, or Ace just simply be able to out-survive and prolong the game to the point that 10-cost Roger can overcome them. However, Blue-Purple Luffy is the king of late game, and that still has not changed. if Blooper Luffy can get to the end game, which is a big if, honestly, then there's absolutely no other leader in the game that can do what Blooper Luffy does. Blooper Luffy being able to play a 9-cost 9,000 that plays an 8-cost 10,000 or another 9-cost 9,000 is just extremely powerful with how fast it can come out because you ramp into this as well. The one thing holding back Blooper Luffy is going to be his consistency, though. Once Blooper Luffy gets to that 10 dunk turn, he will just eventually be able to outpace and out-resource any deck within the game, but up until that point, you're basically at the mercy of your draws. Do you find your ramp cards? Do you have your first 9-cost Sanji? Do you have your target for your first 9-cost Sanji are going to be very pivotal, because if you don't have your target for the 9-cost Sanji, then you do kind of feel like you're just playing a standard ramp deck. So really getting all of the pieces of the puzzle for Blooper Luffy is going to be very important to actually making him as strong as he possibly could be, but when you do get that high roll, he is so powerful. And for that reason, he's been doing quite well in OP14. You just need to dodge Emu, who is honestly a very difficult matchup going first and second. The reason why I like Blooper Luffy in this category of anti-Emu decks is because it's a deck that does very good into Ace, Mihawk, and Hancock, while also doing well into some of the other decks that exist that do well into Ace, Emu, and Hancock, like Green Bonney. So let's talk about Green Bonney next, passing it over to my friend OPTCG.
Coming from the CS, where I did really, really well, and obviously dodged Emu until top cut, like, it's a conscious decision. I know bringing Bonney into OP14 that, like, if I hit 2 or 3 Emu, I'm probably done. But for the rest of the meta, honestly, Bonney feels like a really, really good deck in OP14 just because it's similar to stuff like Blue Purple Luffy or sort of like Purple Doflamingo, where you have one bad matchup that you're kind of trying to dodge. And you can't really tech too much for Emu because you're just going to throw away all of your other matchups. So you really have to kind of make a decision. You can do the best you can. And one of the things I did is I ran 4 of the 5-cost Perona with 6-cost Law to try and mitigate the pressure coming from Emu, and to make it so that I could set up a win con that would work, which is actually how I won the top 8 game of the Tokyo CS. I think Bonney does honestly fairly well into the meta. There's no the only problem is there's no 80-20 matchups for Bonney in OP14. I don't think she's super duper winning into any of these top meta leaders. But if you play well, if things go correctly, and as long as if you hit a Mihawk, they steal first and they get the God roll against you, it's going to be hard, right? You have to take those risks. If you want to just bring Mihawk and just hope that you draw all your cards and things go well and you play well, that's also totally an awesome option. And I really thought about it. But just my reps on Bonney and knowing that I had a higher skill cap, skill ceiling with my own playing with Bonney, is the deciding factor for what made me really want to choose her and take her to the CS final. Currently working on the OP14 Bonney guide. So by the time this video comes out, it'll probably be close to being finished. I wanted to take my time and make sure I had completely figured out everything that I thought I could do, to the best of my ability for OP14 to help anyone in the West who's thinking about taking her to Nats, for example, in North America. So please be on the lookout for that, and I'm going to try my best to make it as helpful and as good as humanly possible.
Thank you, Fidelio, for your comments on Bonney. Congratulations once again on doing so well in the Tokyo Championship. Make sure to check out his channel. His link is going to be below. And now let's talk about the final deck in this category, and one that doesn't perfectly fit into the namesake of this category and being completely throw away Emu and beat everything else, and that is going to be Crocodile. Crocodile is a deck that can beat Emu if you win the dice roll, but it is quite unfavored. And another matchup that is unfavored is the Ace matchup. A lot of people say that the Ace matchup is completely unwinnable for Crocodile, and while it is difficult, it's not impossible. But for that reason, I want to give you a couple of tips in this Ace matchup for you Crocodile players. Now, Crocodile as a deck is very good at stopping the opponent's attacks, but it's not very good at dealing with the opponent's 10 costs. One of the cores to Crocodile's power is the 8-cost 10,000 Secret Rare Crocodile. This character on play will lock a 9-cost or less, not allowing them to attack until the end of the opponent's next end phase, and then if the opponent has a 0-cost or an 8-cost or higher, you draw 1 card. And additionally, this also has an on-KO effect. If you trash 1 card from your hand, you can play this card from your trash. Essentially, with Crocodile's leader effect, you can play this Crocodile and KO it on the exact same turn, meaning that you can lock 2 characters in 1 turn, making it very difficult for the opponent to actually get over your defenses. However, against 10 costs like the 10-cost Newgate, Crocodile only being able to reach a 9-cost or less when it's first played makes it not actually able to reach that 10-cost. Though you can use your leader effect to reduce the opponent's cost by 10 and to then lock it with Crocodile, it still doesn't change the fact that it's a blocker, meaning that although you aren't letting them attack, you're also not really getting attacks through either. It's for this reason that the best way to deal with the Ace is through this card, the 5-cost Miss Double Finger and the 7-cost Robin. being able to play down the 5-cost Double Finger innately is always going to essentially be a 7-cost because of how many cards are going to be in your trash. 7 cost means that it's not bounceable by Jose, and really what you're looking for is not to play Crocodile as soon as possible, but to play Robin. This Miss Sunday can play out the 4-cost Mr. 2 Bunkley and the Miss Valentine to not only expand your resources, but also with your leader effect, immediately KO Bunkley to play out the 5-cost Miss Double Finger. This expands your board with a lot of power and also gives yourself protection at the same time. And what you're trying to do is to set up 2 attackers on the board before the opponent can get their first 10-cost Newgate on the board. If you can manage to get to this position and then you start chaining things like the 8-cost Crocodile, then you can eventually pull back the game to a state where the opponent's not getting any progress on you, and because you have a little bit more attacks than the opponent, then you're slowly but surely chipping away at the opponent's resources. Yes, things like Red Rock exists, but they do have to skip one of their turns that they could be playing a 10-cost Newgate, so as long as you are keeping up your tempo and trying to hold up as best as you possibly can, this matchup is winnable, but most of the time it does come down to the dice roll. You do really want second in this matchup. Still, Crocodile is a really, really fun, really unique deck that is extremely oppressive against decks like Mihawk and Hancock, just due to the fact that you don't really need to focus on the opponent's board. Mihawk and Hancock have very powerful and very potent boards that are very difficult to get rid of, and Crocodile just being able to lock these cards, just not letting them attack, means that he doesn't have to interact with them at all, just goes for your life, and eventually you get dried out. There's nothing that you can do because you can't hit him, and he, though very slowly, will eventually kill you out. Crocodile is my favorite OP14 leader, though he isn't necessarily top tier, but I do think that he is in contention for one of these higher tier decks, just due to the fact that he has so much power built into his deck, and because he is such a good matchup into a lot of these OP14 leaders. If your local meta just happens to have a lot of people off of Ace and Emu, whether they're excited for the new meta, or it turns out that I was completely wrong and these decks are complete ass and it's just OP14 all day, then I think that Crocodile is one of the best leaders that you can play. So I'm excited for the day that Crocodile can finally break into the meta because he's so close. Now let's talk about another deck that actually kind of falls into this category of just needing to dodge Emu that I've purposely separated because it's a new deck that has kind of been repopularized with EB04, and that is Foxy. Do remember that EB04 is not out in Japan, which means I have not been able to test these cards thoroughly, so what I say is going to be anecdotal things that I've heard from my friends who have tested the decks. Foxy is a very, very good deck. The leader effect is as strong as ever, just being able to deny the opponent attacks constantly, similar to how Crocodile works. And the 1-cost Protege Searcher is just extremely good in this deck. Not only does it increase your consistency, which has always been a little bit of an issue for Foxy, but more importantly, being able to develop a Foxy Pirate card on the board is going to make it much easier for you to use your leader effect. The 8-cost Foxy as well is just a very powerful card within this deck. Going second, ramping up to 10 Dong fast, playing down the 8-cost Foxy, and continuously using your leader effect to lock the opponent's characters before they have a chance to use them is exceptionally powerful. Speaking Foxy, actually probably one of the strongest decks that came out of EB04. So I think that this deck does really have legs, unlike the next thing we're going to talk about, which is Kaido. Now, Kaido, unfortunately, has a lot of really, really good support, but just doesn't quite make it to the finish line. He has all of the tools that he needs to be a really good deck, but he's just a little bit frail in comparison to a lot of the OP13 and OP14 decks. These decks just have so many resources and so many ways to be able to fight the opponent in ways that aren't just the board, that although Kaido has very powerful cards on the board, they just don't feel like enough in the face of all of these leaders that are just drawing cards whenever they feel like it, essentially. So it's for this reason that while Kaido does have very good cards, we just haven't been able to see the success that we really wanted, just due to the fact that he doesn't really survive up to the point that he can really shine within the meta. This is somewhat unfortunate, as Kaido just seemed really, really cool, but maybe as time passes and we maybe get a little bit more support, or maybe even a new Kaido leader, as we've seen Bandai has been printing out similar but upgraded effects like we saw with Red Ace and the new Red Blue Lucy, that there is hope that we'll get some new iteration on Kaido that will use these cards much better. So if you are a Kaido coper, let's hold out, because I'm sure that there's going to be something very soon for us. You don't want to go down there. The only team that floats down there are Moria players. Before we talk about some cards that are going to change the game in EB03, let's first wrap up some loose ends talking about 2 decks that we have been talking about in a couple of other videos. Black Yellow Moria and Purple Doflamingo. Purple Doflamingo saw moderate success at the start of OP14 just due to the fact that it's a very good deck to catch people off guard. Once people start to understand how to play against the deck, however, it does tend to struggle a little bit. And interestingly, we have seen the West sort of echo this pattern. Purple Doflamingo has been doing quite well in the West, all things considered, despite it not doing very well in the East, but as it did in the East, I expect that the play rate of this deck will slowly come down as people start to understand how to play against it more, just knowing exactly when to hit and when not to hit. Black Yellow Moria, on the other hand, is basically considered a rogue deck right now, but in the most recent Australia finals, Moria actually went 10-0 in Swiss. Though they unfortunately lost in the top 32, this still is a testament, I think, to the strength of this deck. I won't go over these decks too in depth in this video because they really haven't changed all too much since my OP14 video that I posted, which you can find in the description below. But as for the Black Yellow Moria, the person who actually played Moria at the Australia finals did actually make a YouTube channel in celebration of this milestone. So if you are curious about Black Yellow Moria, I will link his stuff below as well to just check him out, because he's obviously going to be able to tell you more about this deck than I can. Still, with that being said, let's now talk about some of the EB03 changes. EB03 brings a lot of new decks to the game, and like how EB04 kind of brought Kaido and Foxy back into limelight, there are a lot of decks that were completely unviable before that now may be viable. Specifically, Carrot and Sanji are both decks that could potentially be very good once they finally get both the support of EB03 and EB04. Carrot finally having access to both Elaclaw and the 6-cost Carrot, as well as Sanji finally having access to the 5-cost Reiju alongside some cards like Stealth Black from EB04, makes these decks a completely different deck. However, because I haven't been able to test these decks enough, though I think that both of them, including the new Vivi leader, are really powerful, I'm going to refrain from knocking them within this video, and I'm going to talk about in a similar video that'll come out in maybe about a month. The focus on this video is going to be talking about some more individual cards that are buffing some other leaders that are already prevalent in this meta, and talking about how the meta may change depending on these cards. Starting with the 5-cost Nami. This 5-cost Nami that we have talked about here and there within this video is going to be probably the biggest game changer to the entire game. It is so completely oversat in what it can do. It's a 5-cost 6,000 value, which is already an exceptional power line that has the on-play effect to peel one of the opponent's life, attach one dong to your leader, and on KO play another card that could also be another Nami. Just has so many good things going for the card that basically most yellow decks can and should be running this card. This is just a generic buff to yellow, and the biggest beneficiary of this is of course going to be Boa Hancock. Boa Hancock, though she does have a very powerful mid-game and late-game, just having more options specifically on that 5 and 6 dong turn in having this 5-cost Nami is going to hugely bolster the power of this deck. There are also two other decks that greatly benefit from this 5-cost Nami, and that is the Yellow Luffy leader and Blue Yellow Nami. Blue Yellow Nami and Yellow Luffy both are Straw Hat types, which means that not only can they use this 5-cost Nami, but they can also use the 7-cost Robin. The 7-cost Robin, being able to trash one of your life cards to then gain 2, is very specifically made for Blue Yellow Nami, because by moving one life, you also get a draw at the same time. Simultaneously, because this character's on KO effect deals 1 damage to the opponent, if the opponent is at 0 life, they will lose the game. So do be careful if you're on the receiving end of the 7-cost Robin. Do not kill the 7-cost Robin when you're at 0 life, or you will lose. But talking about these decks more specifically, Yellow Luffy is a leader that has been surprisingly strong for a lot of people, and has quite a bit of flexibility in the way that it can be built. You can build more towards the Straw Hat side, which is focusing on the consistency and life burn on the opponent's life to close out the game with things like this new event. Or you can play through the Thriller Bark version, which just runs an insane number of triggers, fully utilizing the 6 life that Luffy has. And Blue Yellow Nami, a similarly tanky leader, though she does have 4 life, does have the ability to make her leader 7,000 power. This, alongside having access to the blue package, means that you're a yellow leader that does not focus as much on triggers, but instead focuses on resources, card draw, and getting rid of the opponent's resources through things like Red Rock, Gravity Blade, or Pudding should you choose to run them. Now, statistically, according to the rank sim, Yellow Luffy is already a very powerful deck, being the highest win rate deck within the game right now, but I do think this is more just people not being used to playing yellow, because understanding how to play against yellow does take a little bit of time and commitment, and if you haven't played against it in a while, then you will suffer. Knowing when to attack and when not to attack is going to be something that you need to know when you're playing against yellow, same as when you're fighting against Hancock, so just be careful when you are fighting these decks. Do not hit too early, because they may trigger out something crazy if they're running Thriller Bark package, but also not to start hitting too late as well, because due to the fact that these decks both have really good ways to increase their life, if you hold out the game for too long, then they eventually may get to 8, 9, or even 10 life. Blue Yellow Nami in particular as well also has a new search event that basically searches anything in your deck, excluding things like other 1 costs and the 10 cost new gates. Being able to find any card within your deck just drastically increases the consistency of this deck, because it's generally just been a good stuff deck running all of the good blue and yellow cards, and this sort of event just perfectly wraps it all together into a package that greatly increases consistency. Another leader that has received buffs in EB04, though maybe slightly, is also Blue Purple Luffy. Blue Purple Luffy with the new 7-cost Big Mom gives you a very strong curve going second. Blue Purple Luffy generally did want to go second already, just due to the fact that he doesn't have access to things like 8-cost Katakuri or the 9-cost Bomb anymore, resulting in a game plan that focuses more on getting to 10 dong quickly rather than actually just playing the strong mid game. But the 7-cost Mom makes things a lot better when you're going second. By ramping once on 4, next turn you're going to be at 7 dong, and playing this Mom not only ramps you 1 dong, which means that you're going to be on 10 dong the next turn, but it also sets up for your first leader effect, allowing you to put one of the cards in your hand onto the top of your deck. being able to force one of the cards in your hand on top of the deck means that you're guaranteed to have a 9-cost Sanji target should you have the 9-cost Sanji in your hand. So all in all, it's just a great card for Blue Purple Luffy if you can manage to find the space for it. Because it does have 1000 counter as well, it isn't too hard to fit into your deck, but you will have to cut away at things like the 5-cost Nami within your deck to actually make space for it. And finally, the last deck that we're going to talk about, which is just more of a personal favorite for me, is Red Black Sabo. Red Black Sabo is a deck that's always been close to being good, but just due to the fact that it doesn't have all the cards that it really wants to run in that promo Sabo or the 4-cost Koala in EB03, it's never really been able to be within the meta completely. And finally, EB03 does bring the 4-cost Koala. This card is just very powerful, extremely annoying, sets up for your leader effect, as well as on KO being able to play out exceptionally powerful cards like that 6-cost Sabo. And while Sabo is stable and generally good within the meta, I have mixed feelings about him because it does feel like he's received these cards a little bit too late. If he had all of these cards maybe about a month or a month and a half ago, then I think he really could have been a strong meta contender. But just due to the fact that we didn't get these cards in time, and now we have things like EB04 coming into the meta, it feels like a little bit too little too late. So while he's still a very good leader, and I think is completely fine to bring because he just has a generally solid matchup spread across the board, it's not like he's actually that much better than any other leader in the meta. So if you're actually playing to win, I don't necessarily see a reason to choose him over some other choices, which is unfortunate, but still it's two sides of a coin. He is good enough to play, but he's maybe just not good enough to bring if you are seriously trying to win. Thank you guys for watching this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you liked it, maybe consider liking and subscribing. Maybe also check out the video that's on the screen right now, which is curated specifically for you. In any case, unfortunately, it has started to rain a little bit, which seems to happen every single time that I try to record, whether it's rain or snow. So I'm going to go inside now to record before my camera gets destroyed. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'll see you guys next time, and bye-bye.